Ryan lived alone in a wooden cabin on the frozen planet called Vera. The planet was quiet, covered in endless snow and long winters. The cabin stood near a frozen valley where the wind always howled. Most humans avoided this planet, but Ryan chose it for peace. He worked as a mechanic and fixed machines for passing traders. They came sometimes with broken ships or damaged tools, and Ryan always found a way to repair them. The cabin was small but warm. Inside it had a metal stove, shelves full of tools, and a corner with spare machine parts. Ryan's days were simple. He woke early, lit the fire, drank hot tea, and spent hours working on small engines. He liked the sound of gears turning and the smell of oil. It reminded him that even in this frozen land, life still moved. Sometimes, he thought about leaving the planet. Traders told stories about busy colonies with bright lights, markets, and music. But Ryan felt that kind of life was not for him. He wanted quiet. He wanted space to think. The cabin gave him that. The only sound was the wind outside and the crunch of snow under his boots. But peace on a planet like Vera was never simple. The winters grew stronger each year. The storms lasted longer, and the snow buried everything in white silence. Ryan had to work hard to keep his cabin safe. He checked the roof, cleared the ice, and kept fuel ready for the stove. If the fire went out, he knew the cold would take him in hours. That night began like every other. Ryan sat near the stove, polishing a small engine part. The flames gave the cabin a soft glow, and outside the window, snow fell slowly from the dark sky. The wind was low, almost gentle. Ryan felt calm. Then he heard it. A strange sound drifted through the storm. At first, he thought it was only the wind changing direction. But then it came again, louder this time. It was not the sound of machines or wild animals. It was deeper, like a cry that carried pain. Ryan put down the tool in his hand and listened. The cry echoed across the valley, rolling through the snow like thunder. He felt a shiver run down his spine. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. His breath turned to ice in the air, and the snow crunched under his boots. He pulled the coat tighter and walked a few steps away from the cabin. The sound came again. This time it was closer. Through the swirling snow, he saw shapes moving in the distance. At first, he thought they were boulders shifting in the wind. But boulders did not move like that. The shapes were large, tall as trees, and they swayed as they walked. Ryan's heart pounded. He had heard rumors from traders about the creatures of Vera. Some called them dragons, though they were not like the fire-breathing beasts of old stories. These were alien creatures, born on this icy planet. Strong, scaled, and winged, they ruled the sky and mountains. Humans avoided them, for no one wanted to test their strength. Now, a whole herd of them was walking toward his cabin. Ryan froze in place. He counted at least 10, maybe more, moving slowly through the snow. Their wings hung heavy, their steps dragged, and their scales glistened with frost. They looked tired, almost broken. The largest one stopped and lowered its head. Even from a distance, Ryan could feel the power in its gaze. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, not with anger, but with something else. He wanted to run back into the cabin, lock the door, and pretend he had seen nothing. But he could not move. The sound of their cries still echoed in his ears. It was not a sound of rage. It was a sound of desperation. The herd gathered near the cabin. The snow swirled around them, covering their bodies in white. Their breaths came out as thick clouds of steam. Some bent their wings close to the ground. Others collapsed in the snow, too weak to stand. Ryan felt fear twist inside him, but another feeling grew stronger. He had seen broken machines, damaged engines, and helpless travelers before. He knew the look of something near failure. And that was what he saw in the dragons. The largest dragon stepped forward. Its scales were cracked, and frost clung to its chest. It lowered its head until its snout was near the ground, right in front of Ryan. Its eyes locked on him, glowing with silent meaning. Ryan swallowed hard. He could not understand their language, but he did not need to. The plea was clear. They needed help. The snow fell heavier. The wind grew stronger. The herd shivered, their great bodies trembling in the cold. Ryan looked back at his cabin, small and warm with its stove burning. Then he looked at the herd, stranded and desperate. He did not know why they came to him, a simple human mechanic. But something inside him told him that this night would change his life. The cry came again, softer this time, as if the herd waited for his answer. Ryan stood in the snow, caught between fear and duty, and the silence of the frozen planet wrapped around him. The storm pressed hard against the valley, but Ryan stood still, his eyes fixed on the herd before him. The alien dragons were unlike anything he had ever seen up close. Their bodies shimmered faintly under the moonlight, though most of their scales were dull with frost. They were tall and powerful, wings stretching wide even though they hung heavy with ice. The air around them carried a deep sound, not words but cries of exhaustion and pain. Ryan's breath trembled as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Stories from traders had painted these creatures as fierce rulers of the sky. He had imagined them flying above the peaks, strong and untouchable. But the herd in front of his cabin did not look untouchable. They looked broken. One smaller dragon collapsed into the snow. Its chest heaved as it tried to breathe, its sides rising and falling in slow rhythm. Another dragon bent its head close to the ground, as though searching for warmth that was not there. The great leader, the largest of them all, lowered itself carefully, its golden eyes fixed on Ryan as if waiting for him to act. Ryan's heart raced. He had no idea what to do. He was only a mechanic, not a healer, not a soldier. His life had been filled with machines, not living giants with wings and scales. Yet as he stood there, he realized the dragons were not here to harm him. If they had wanted that, his cabin would already be gone. They had come for another reason. They had come for help. He took a slow step forward. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the dragons watched him. Even in their weakness, their eyes glowed with an inner fire, and their presence filled the frozen air with weight. Ryan raised his hand slowly, showing he carried no weapon. His breath came out in white clouds as he whispered, almost to himself. "You came here for me." The leader lowered its head further. The movement was slow, careful, and heavy, like a gesture of trust. Ryan swallowed. He felt the power of the moment. A wild part of him wanted to run back to the cabin, close the door, and stay safe. But another part of him, the part that fixed broken things, pushed him forward. He moved closer until he could see the frost covering their wings. The ice had eaten into their scales, leaving cracks that glistened in the moonlight. He noticed burns on the edges of their skin, strange marks that did not look natural. It reminded him of broken metal left in the cold too long. Ryan knelt in the snow beside the smaller dragon that had collapsed. Its breath was shallow, each exhale sending a puff of steam into the air. He placed a hand carefully on its side. The scales were rough and cold, almost like stone. The body beneath shivered with weakness. The dragon's eye shifted slightly, focusing on him. Ryan felt a wave of connection, silent yet powerful. He pulled his hand back and stood again. His mind was racing. He thought about the machines that once dotted the valley. Heat wells, built long ago by human colonists, had once pushed warmth into the ground. Traders told him those machines had failed after years of neglect. Without them, the winters had grown harsher. Perhaps these creatures had once relied on that heat. Perhaps they had lived strong and free when the valley was warm, but now, with the wells broken, the cold was too much even for them. The thought made sense. Ryan's mechanic instincts woke. He knew broken systems when he saw them, and this valley felt like a broken system. The dragons were not just sick. They were victims of a land that had lost its balance. The leader shifted closer. The ground trembled as its claws pressed into the snow. Its head came down until it hovered just above Ryan. Warm breath poured out in a cloud of steam, covering him in heat for a moment before the cold swallowed it again. The dragon's eye stared deep into his. Ryan felt no fear in that moment. Instead, he felt understanding. The dragon was asking him without words. It was pleading for help. Ryan nodded slowly. "I will try." The herd stirred faintly, as though his words had reached them. Wings rustled weakly. Heads lifted a little higher. The cries softened. Ryan turned back to his cabin. He needed tools, heat lamps, and supplies. He could not heal living creatures the way doctors could, but he could provide shelter and warmth. He could mend machines, and perhaps he could mend the valley itself. Inside the cabin, he lit extra lamps and pulled out portable heaters he had salvaged from old traders. He carried them outside and placed them in the snow, surrounding the weaker dragons with small circles of warmth. The air shimmered faintly as the heat pushed back against the cold. The smaller dragon sighed and stretched slightly, its breath no longer so shallow. The leader watched him closely. Its head rose higher now, and its wings shifted as though shaking off a little of the frost. The other dragons moved nearer, forming a ring around the cabin, their great bodies pressing into the snow like tired guardians. Ryan worked through the night. He brought out blankets of thermal fabric, laying them over the weakest dragons. He checked the heaters, adjusted them, and refueled them. His hands grew numb, but he kept moving. The dragons watched in silence, their eyes following every step. As dawn approached, the storm began to ease. The sky turned pale gray, and the snowflakes grew lighter. The valley looked less cruel, though still endless in its cold. The herd no longer cried. They lay quietly, gathering strength from the heat Ryan had provided. Ryan stood at the edge of the cabin, looking at them. His cabin looked so small compared to their massive bodies, yet they had chosen to come here. A human mechanic, with nothing but tools and old heaters, had become their hope. For the first time in years, Ryan felt something more than peace. He felt purpose. He knew this was only the beginning. The dragons were alive for now, but the valley was still broken. If he wanted to save them, he would need to face the deeper problem. He would need to find the ruined heat wells and bring warmth back to the land. The leader lifted its head toward the rising sun. Its breath rose in a cloud of steam. Then it looked back at Ryan, eyes glowing with trust. Ryan nodded again. "I will not let you down." The frozen planet was silent once more, but in that silence a bond had formed. A bond between a lone human and a desperate herd of alien dragons. The sun was weak on Vera. Even at midday it gave little warmth, only a pale light that fell across the frozen valley. Ryan stood outside his cabin and watched the herd of dragons rest. They were quiet now, but the silence was heavy. The dragons were not healed. They were only waiting, hoping for more. The heaters hummed softly, spreading small pockets of warmth into the snow. Ryan had placed them carefully around the weakest dragons, but the valley was too large, and the cold swallowed the heat quickly. He could see frost returning to their wings already. Their strength would not last long. Ryan rubbed his hands together and thought. He was not a healer, not a man of medicine. Yet the dragons looked at him with eyes that seemed to ask for something only he could give. He remembered the stories of the old heat wells, machines that once pushed warmth deep into the ground. He knew they had been built by colonists, then abandoned when the colony failed. Perhaps the dragons had always lived near those wells. Perhaps their survival depended on the warmth the machines gave. Without the wells, the winters had grown too harsh even for them. That would explain why they had come to him. They must have sensed the skill in his hands, the way he carried tools and worked with machines. Somehow, they had understood that he was the one who could repair what was broken. Ryan felt a strange weight settle on his shoulders. It was not the kind of responsibility he had ever asked for, but it was there all the same. The leader of the herd rose slowly from where it had been lying. Its massive wings spread slightly, sending a rush of frost into the air. The dragon stepped closer to Ryan, its golden eyes bright against the pale snow. Each step was careful, deliberate. When it stopped before him, it lowered its head again until its snout nearly touched the ground. Ryan could see every crack in its scales, every line where frost had bitten deep. He could hear its breath, slow and heavy. He felt the power of the moment, as though the dragon was bowing, not in weakness, but in trust. Ryan placed a hand against his chest. "You want me to fix this land? You want me to bring back the warmth?" The dragon's eye blinked slowly, almost like a nod. Ryan's throat tightened. He had fixed engines, ships, and tools, but never something that meant the difference between life and death for an entire species. His cabin felt small behind him, his tools too few, his knowledge too simple. But the dragons waited. They believed. And that belief filled him with courage. He stepped back into the cabin and pulled out his bag of tools. Wrenches, hammers, cables, and coils of wire filled the bag until it was heavy on his shoulder. He also packed a small scanner, one of the few advanced devices he had kept from a trader's payment. It could locate old energy signatures, faint but useful. When he returned outside, the dragons shifted their heads to watch him. The leader bent low again and gave a deep rumble that vibrated through the snow. Ryan felt it in his chest. "I understand," he whispered. "Show me where to go." The leader turned slowly, then lifted its head toward the distant mountains. The motion was clear. The ruined heat wells lay somewhere beyond the valley. Ryan nodded. His path was set. But before he could leave, he had to make sure the herd would survive while he was gone. He worked quickly, adding fuel to the heaters and checking every connection. He placed the warmest lamps near the young dragons, who trembled the most in the cold. The dragons watched in silence. Their eyes followed his every move, and their breaths came slower, calmer. For a moment, Ryan felt as though he was part of them, as though his cabin had become their shelter too. Finally, he was ready. He adjusted his coat, tightened his gloves, and slung the heavy tool bag over his back. The leader dragon lowered itself again, and this time its wing shifted, opening slightly as if to shield him from the icy wind. Ryan felt the warmth of its body rush against him. "I will come back," he said firmly. Stay strong until then. He set off into the snow, his boots sinking with every step. The valley stretched wide, endless white hills rolling into the distance. The wind bit at his face, but he kept moving. He knew the scanner would help him find the wells, but it would not protect him from the cold. He had to rely on his own strength. As he walked, he thought of the silent plea in the dragon's eyes. They had chosen him, trusted him, and that trust burned brighter in his chest than any fire. He was only one man, but one man with skill, and sometimes that was enough. Hours passed. The scanner beeped faintly, its screen glowing in the pale light. The signal was weak but steady. Ryan followed it across frozen ridges and down into icy gullies. His legs grew heavy, but he pressed on. At last, he saw it. Rising from the snow was the broken shape of a machine tower. Rust clung to its sides, and half of it was buried in ice. It was one of the heat wells. Once it had burned with life, sending warmth through the valley, but now it was silent, a grave of metal. Ryan dropped to his knees beside it. His fingers brushed the frozen surface, feeling the age and decay. The scanner confirmed what he already knew. The core was dead. But the structure was still there. If he could repair it, if he could restart the system, maybe the valley would breathe warmth again. He set down his bag and began to work. His breath fogged the air, his fingers stiff with cold, but his mind sharpened. He removed panels, checked wires, and studied the old design. The technology was crude by modern standards, but it was something he understood. Machines were machines, no matter their age. Hours slipped by as he worked. The sun dipped low again, leaving the sky painted in pale gray and silver. The wind roared across the valley, but Ryan stayed focused. His hands moved with purpose. The dragon's silent plea rang in his ears, driving him forward. When the first spark lit inside the broken core, his heart leapt. It was small, faint, but it was life. Ryan leaned closer, feeding power into the machine with his own portable cells. The hum grew louder, a deep vibration spreading through the ground. The ice around the base began to crack. Steam hissed into the air. The heat well was waking. Ryan smiled for the first time that day. He knew the battle was far from over, but hope had begun to stir. The heat well groaned as life returned to it. Steam rose from vents hidden under the snow, and the ground trembled with a low hum. Ryan stood back and wiped the frost from his face. His body ached from hours of work, but the sight filled him with hope. The machine was breathing again, and with it, the valley might start to heal. He knelt beside the base and checked the readings on his scanner. The energy output was weak but steady. The core still needed fuel, and many of the outer pipes were frozen solid. The heat well could not warm the entire valley alone. It was only one among many, and the rest were still buried under years of ice. Ryan stood and looked across the frozen horizon. The thought weighed heavy on him. There were at least 6 more heat wells scattered through the valley. Traders had spoken of them long ago. If all of them were dead, the land would never recover unless he repaired each one. He looked back toward the distant ridge where his cabin lay hidden. The herd was there, waiting for him. He pictured their glowing eyes, the way they had watched him with silent trust. They were counting on him, and that thought pushed away his doubt. Ryan packed up his tools and marked the location of the heat well on his scanner. He would return with better supplies later. For now, he needed to see how many others still existed and how damaged they were. The wind picked up again as he trekked deeper into the valley. Snow whipped against his coat, and the cold bit into his hands despite the thick gloves. His breath came out in clouds of white. Yet he pressed forward. Each step felt like part of a promise he had made to creatures who could not speak but who had asked him in their own way. Hours passed before he found the next heat well. This one was worse than the first. The tower had collapsed, half buried under ice. Only twisted metal arms stuck out of the snow, reaching toward the sky like broken fingers. Ryan's heart sank. Repairing this one would be harder. He climbed over the mound of ice and studied the ruins. The core was gone, shattered long ago. Without a new one, the machine would never function again. He sat in the snow and thought. He could not build a new core from scrap. The materials were rare and powerful. But maybe the other heat wells still had parts he could salvage. If he could piece together what remained of the old network, he might restart at least some of them. That would bring enough warmth to the valley to keep the herd alive. The sun dipped lower, casting a pale red glow across the land. Ryan knew he had to return before nightfall. He set a beacon near the ruins so he could find the place again, then turned back toward his cabin. His legs felt heavy, and the cold gnawed at his strength, but he kept moving. When he finally reached the ridge and looked down, his heart stirred. The dragons were still there. Their massive bodies formed a circle around the cabin. Steam rose faintly from their breaths, glowing in the twilight. They had waited, just as he had hoped. As Ryan stepped into the valley, the leader lifted its head. A deep rumble rolled through the herd, and the dragons shifted, wings rustling weakly. Ryan felt the sound travel through the ground and into his chest. It was not a threat. It was a welcome. He walked among them slowly, his boots crunching on the snow. The smaller dragons leaned closer, their eyes glowing in the fading light. The weak ones were still alive, huddled near the heaters he had left behind. Their breaths were steadier now, though their bodies still shivered. The leader bent its head low again, bringing its golden eyes level with Ryan. He placed his hand on the dragon's snout. The scales were still cold, but there was warmth underneath, fighting to return. "I found one of the heat wells," he said quietly. "It is working again, but the others are broken. I will need time." The dragon's eye blinked slowly, and its chest rose in a deep breath. The herd settled into silence, as if they understood. That night, Ryan sat inside his cabin, staring into the flames of the stove. His body was tired, but his mind refused to rest. He thought about the broken towers buried in the valley, the way frost had cracked their metal. He thought about the herd outside, their lives tied to machines they could not repair themselves. He realized something then. The dragons were not just asking for help. They were giving him a purpose. He had lived alone for years, hidden away from the noise of human colonies. He had told himself he was content with the quiet, but deep inside, he had felt empty. Now, for the first time, his work mattered in a way greater than trade or survival. It mattered to lives beyond his own. The next morning, Ryan woke early and prepared for another journey. He packed food, fuel cells, and more tools. He strapped heaters to a sled and tied the scanner to his belt. As he stepped outside, the herd stirred. The leader raised its head and gave a low rumble, a sound that carried both strength and warning. Ryan smiled faintly. "I know. I will be careful." He set off again, this time toward the mountains. The herd watched him go, their eyes glowing like lanterns in the snow. By midday he reached another heat well, hidden in a deep hollow. This one still stood, though its panels were thick with ice. Ryan cleared the snow from its base and opened the control panel. Inside, the wires were frozen and corroded. But the core was intact. He knelt down, heart racing. This one could work again. He pulled out his tools and began to repair, his breath fogging the air as he worked. The silence of the valley pressed around him, broken only by the sound of metal clinking and wires snapping into place. As he worked, he thought again of the herd waiting behind him. He pictured the young dragons breathing easier, their wings free of frost. He pictured the leader lifting its head proudly as warmth returned to the valley. The vision gave him strength. When the second heat well roared to life, steam poured from its vents and the ground trembled. Ryan stepped back, chest rising with pride. 2 wells now burned, and the valley was waking. He turned toward the distant ridge, his eyes sharp with determination. There were more to find, more to repair. And until every dragon was safe, he would not stop. The second heat well rumbled with new life, sending warm steam into the frozen air. Ryan stood beside it, his face red from the cold but his eyes bright with determination. He had repaired 2 machines now, and the valley no longer felt so empty. For the first time in years, the ground beneath his boots felt alive. But the work was far from finished. He knew there were still other heat wells scattered through the valley. Some were broken beyond repair, and others would need more than quick fixes. Without them, the warmth would never spread far enough. The herd could not survive with only 2 working machines. Ryan packed his tools and began the long walk back to his cabin. The journey was slow. The snow reached his knees, and the icy wind cut through his coat. His legs ached with every step. Yet he kept going, driven by the thought of the herd waiting for him. By the time he reached the ridge, night had already fallen. The stars shone above, cold and sharp. Down in the valley, the dragons stirred as they saw him return. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like scattered lanterns. Ryan trudged into the circle of massive bodies. The leader stepped forward and lowered its head, releasing a deep rumble that echoed across the valley. Ryan placed a hand against its snout. The scales were still cold, but he felt strength returning beneath the surface. "I repaired another," he said softly. "There is hope." The herd shifted, wings rustling against the snow. The younger dragons raised their heads, their breath steadier than before. Ryan smiled faintly. His work was making a difference. That night, he barely slept. The storm howled outside, rattling the walls of his cabin. Inside, the stove burned bright, but Ryan sat awake, staring at the maps he had drawn of the valley. He marked the locations of the heat wells he had found and guessed at where the others might lie. His hand shook from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. At dawn, he packed again. This time he added extra fuel cells, ropes, and stronger tools. He knew the deeper he went into the valley, the harder the repairs would be. The herd watched him prepare. The leader gave a low rumble, and some of the younger dragons moved closer as if offering to follow. Ryan raised a hand and shook his head. "Not this time. You are too weak. Save your strength." The dragons obeyed, but their eyes followed him as he set off. Ryan felt the weight of their trust pressing against his back with every step. The third heat well was far from his cabin, hidden in a narrow gorge. Snow and ice had swallowed most of it, leaving only the tip of its tower visible. Ryan climbed down carefully, rope tied to his waist, his breath fogging the cold air. The gorge was deep and dark, the wind trapped inside like a growling beast. When he reached the base, his heart sank. The machine was buried under layers of ice as thick as stone. Repairing it would take days. He set up heaters to melt some of the ice, but the process was painfully slow. His fingers grew stiff as he chipped at the frozen surface with his tools. Hours passed. His body grew heavy with fatigue, and his breath turned shallow. The cold pressed against him like an enemy. He thought of the herd waiting in the valley. That thought kept his hands moving even when they shook with weakness. By evening, he had cleared enough to open the outer panels. Inside, the wires were frozen solid, cracked from years of neglect. He tried to reconnect them, but the pieces snapped in his hands. He cursed under his breath, then forced himself to stay calm. Machines did not respond to anger. They responded to patience. He worked through the night, his lamps glowing weakly against the dark gorge. At times, he thought he heard movement above, the crunch of snow, the shift of wings. He looked up once and saw shadows circling high in the sky. The herd had sent watchers. Even in their weakness, they kept him in their sight. The next morning, his body screamed for rest, but he refused to stop. He powered the frozen core with his own fuel cells. The first attempt failed. The second failed too. On the third, a faint hum stirred within the machine. Ryan leaned closer, eyes wide. The sound grew, low but steady. Warmth began to seep into the ground. Steam hissed out through cracks in the ice. Ryan collapsed to his knees, too tired to cheer, but inside he felt victory. Another heat well was alive. He stayed in the gorge until the sun dipped low again. Only when he was sure the machine would hold did he climb back out. His muscles ached with every step, and his vision blurred with fatigue. Yet when he reached the open snow, he saw something that gave him strength again. The leader dragon stood on the ridge above the gorge. Its wings were spread wide, its breath steaming in the air. Behind it, other members of the herd waited, their eyes glowing bright. They had followed him after all, too worried to let him face the cold alone. Ryan raised his hand weakly. "It works," he called out. His voice cracked, but the words carried. The leader rumbled, a sound so deep it shook the snow from the cliffs. The herd answered with soft cries that echoed like a chorus across the valley. Ryan climbed slowly toward them, each step a battle. When he finally reached the ridge, the leader bent its head low, almost touching the ground before him. It was not just thanks. It was respect. He placed a hand against the dragon's snout again. "I will repair them all," he whispered. "No matter what it takes." The herd surrounded him as he walked back to the cabin. Their massive bodies moved like guardians in the snow, wings shielding him from the icy wind. For the first time, Ryan did not feel alone in the frozen world. He felt part of something larger, something powerful. That night, as the herd settled near the cabin, Ryan looked out the window and saw the glow of steam rising from 3 points in the valley. The machines were alive again, and the land was beginning to fight back against the endless winter. But he knew the struggle was far from over. The storms would grow stronger. The repairs would grow harder. And the herd's lives depended on his success. The next morning, Ryan woke to the sound of silence. Outside his cabin, the herd rested, their wings folded and their bodies rising with slow breaths. The snow was calm, the air still. For a moment, he thought the worst of the winter had passed. But deep inside, he knew it was only a pause before the true storm. He stepped outside and looked across the valley. 3 plumes of steam rose where the heat wells now worked. The sight filled him with pride, yet he could see how far they were from victory. Many parts of the valley remained buried in cold darkness. The herd needed more than 3 machines. They needed the entire network alive again. Ryan packed his bag with tools and fuel. His hands were rough and blistered from days of work, but he tightened his gloves and ignored the pain. When he turned back toward the cabin, the leader dragon was already waiting. Its massive body blocked the rising sun, and its eyes glowed with quiet strength. "You want to come with me," Ryan said, reading the intent in its posture. He hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. But stay close. The storm is coming." The leader released a deep rumble that shook the snow at his feet. The herd stirred in response, wings shifting, but only the leader followed as Ryan set out. Together, man and dragon crossed the frozen land. They reached the fourth heat well by midday. It was located on a high ridge where the wind howled like a living thing. The structure was half buried, its outer panels torn loose and scattered across the ice. Ryan examined the damage and frowned. This repair would not be simple. He climbed the frozen tower, his rope tied firmly around his waist. The leader dragon watched from below, its breath steaming in the sharp wind. Ryan fought against the icy gusts as he replaced the broken panels. His fingers were numb, but he forced them to move with care. As he worked, the first signs of the storm appeared. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, swallowing the light. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. The valley groaned as the wind grew stronger. Ryan felt the tower sway under him. He tightened his grip and pushed himself harder. The storm would not wait for him to finish. He connected the last wires just as the snow became a blinding wall. The tower gave a low hum, then roared to life. Steam burst into the air, vanishing in the storm. Ryan climbed down slowly, his muscles burning with exhaustion. The leader dragon lowered its head, allowing him to lean against its warm scales. He pressed his hand against the creature, silently thankful. "We must go," he said, raising his voice over the howling wind. "This storm will bury us alive." Together, they fought their way back through the blizzard. The snow came down in sheets, stinging Ryan's face. The leader spread its wings wide, shielding him from the worst of the wind. Even so, each step felt like a battle. By the time they reached the valley floor, the storm had grown monstrous. The other dragons huddled close to Ryan's cabin, their bodies forming a wall against the raging snow. They lifted their heads when they saw him and the leader return. Their eyes glowed faintly through the white haze, filled with relief. Ryan stumbled inside, his clothes frozen stiff, his hands shaking. He lit the stove and collapsed into his chair, staring at the maps spread across the table. 4 machines now worked. Only 2 remained that he had seen on his charts. Beyond those, there might be others buried deep under snow, forgotten with time. Outside, the storm raged through the night. The cabin shook, but the herd stood strong, their massive bodies blocking the wind. Their cries rose above the storm, a sound of endurance. Ryan listened from inside, his heart filled with respect. These creatures had chosen to trust him, and he would not let them down. The next morning, the storm had not passed. Snow piled high against the walls, sealing the door shut. Ryan pushed his way out with effort, breaking through the frozen barrier. What he saw left him silent. The valley was unrecognizable. Mountains of snow covered the land. Only the tips of the tallest towers rose above the white blanket. The herd looked smaller against this endless ocean of ice. Their breaths came in clouds, their wings heavy with frost. Ryan knew what this meant. If he waited for the storm to end on its own, the herd would not survive. He had to keep moving. He turned to the leader dragon, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "We cannot stop now. We must find the last machines." The leader bent its head in agreement. Its eyes burned with the same determination. They set out again, this time with 2 younger dragons following. The snow was too deep for Ryan alone, but the dragons used their massive bodies to clear paths. They pressed forward through the storm, step by step. The 5th heat well was hidden in a canyon. The entrance was nearly blocked with snow, but the dragons used their claws to dig it open. Inside, the wind lessened, and Ryan found the machine half crushed by fallen rocks. He stared at it, despair tightening his chest. The damage was severe. The frame was bent, the wires torn, the power core shattered. For a moment, he thought it was beyond saving. Then he looked at the dragons behind him. Their eyes watched him with trust, not doubt. Ryan knelt by the broken machine. "I will try," he whispered. His hands moved with calm purpose. He replaced wires, built new frames from spare parts, and rerouted the circuits. Piece by piece, the machine began to take shape again. The storm roared outside, but inside the canyon there was only the sound of Ryan's tools and the steady breathing of the dragons. Hours passed. His strength waned, but his spirit did not break. At last, the machine stirred. The faint hum grew stronger until warmth spread through the canyon. Steam hissed from the cracks, rising like victory. The dragons lifted their heads and cried out, their voices echoing across the stone walls. Ryan leaned against the machine, his body weak but his heart strong. He had done it again. They returned to the valley as night fell. 5 machines now glowed with life. The land, once silent, now breathed warmth again. Ryan looked at the herd gathered near his cabin. Their scales shimmered faintly in the firelight of the towers. For the first time, the valley seemed alive with hope. He raised his hand, his voice steady. "One more remains. We will not stop until the last one is alive." The leader lowered its head in agreement, and the herd released a chorus of cries that shook the stars above. Ryan stood among them, a single human in a frozen world, yet no longer alone. He had made a promise, and he would keep it. Ryan woke early, before the pale sun could rise over the frozen valley. He felt the weight of the day ahead. Only one heat well remained, the final machine that would restore warmth across the land. He packed his tools carefully, making sure nothing was left behind. Each item mattered. Every wire, every fuel cell could mean the difference between life and death for the herd. The dragons gathered near the cabin. Their massive bodies formed a protective circle around him as he prepared. The leader lowered its head, eyes meeting Ryan's, glowing with understanding. The trust between them was unspoken but deep. Ryan placed a hand against the dragon's snout. "This is the last one," he said softly. "We will finish this together." The dragon rumbled low, a sound that vibrated through the snow. The younger dragons shifted closer, watching him with wide eyes. He nodded to them, feeling strength in their presence. Though fragile and tired, they were alive, and their lives depended on his work. He set out across the valley, the cold wind biting at his face. The last heat well was in a remote canyon, farther than any of the others. Snow covered the path in deep drifts, and the wind roared like a living creature. The dragons flew above him, lifting clouds of snow and breaking the icy surface so he could walk. Every step was difficult, but he pressed forward. Hours passed. The canyon grew taller as he approached. Its walls were jagged and covered with ice. The heat well was almost invisible, buried under snow and debris. Ryan looked at the massive machine, its frame twisted and frozen. This one was worse than all the others. Pieces of its structure were broken, wires shattered, and the power core was missing. Ryan's heart sank. He knelt beside it, brushing away snow and frost. His hands shook, but he refused to give in to doubt. He looked at the dragons circling above, their wings spread wide, keeping the storm at bay. Their eyes shone with hope. He had to succeed. He removed broken parts and salvaged what he could from the surrounding snow. Every piece mattered. Using his tools, he reconstructed the frame, connecting wires with care. The snowstorm continued, but inside the canyon, Ryan worked with focus. Sweat and frost mixed on his face. His fingers were stiff and raw, but he forced them to move. Hours turned into darkness. Ryan did not stop. The dragons landed near the canyon, their bodies forming a shield against the wind. The leader lowered its head, placing a warm snout against Ryan's shoulder. Its breath steamed into his coat, giving him a moment of comfort. Finally, he held the last piece in place, a glowing crystal he had salvaged from the earlier heat well. It was rare, a natural energy source, and he hoped it would provide the power the machine needed. With careful hands, he installed the crystal into the core. He connected the final wires and pressed the activation switch. The canyon trembled. A low hum began deep in the frozen ground. The machine flickered, then roared to life. Steam hissed from vents, melting ice and warming the air. The temperature in the canyon rose slowly, and warmth spread into the valley beyond. Ryan stumbled back, exhausted but exhilarated. He looked up, and the dragons were lifting their heads, their wings shaking off frost. The young dragon's eyes glowed with life. Even the weakest among them stretched their wings, the frost melting from their scales. The leader stepped forward and lowered its head. It did not touch him, but it allowed Ryan to see its eyes up close. They shone with respect, gratitude, and pride. Ryan realized he was no longer just a human mechanic in a quiet cabin. He had become part of the herd, their protector and friend. He walked back toward the valley, the sound of the fully active heat well humming behind him. The other dragons followed, wings lifting in unison, sending warm gusts across the snow. Ryan felt the ground beneath his feet soften as the ice began to melt. Streams appeared where snow had been solid. Life, slow and fragile, began returning to the valley. When he finally reached his cabin, the herd gathered around him. They pressed their massive bodies against the snow near his home, forming a circle of protection. Ryan looked at them, feeling a warmth deeper than fire. He smiled. They had survived, and together they had restored the land. The leader lowered its head again, close enough that Ryan could feel the warmth of its breath. He placed his hand against its snout one last time. "We did it," he said softly. The dragon rumbled, a low sound that filled the valley, a promise that Ryan understood. They would remain loyal to the human who saved them. They would guard him as he had guarded them. Their bond was silent but unbreakable. Ryan walked into his cabin, tired but happy. He looked out the window at the herd, their bodies glowing faintly in the warmth of the restored valley. The snow melted slowly, revealing rocks, trees, and the frozen river beginning to flow once more. For the first time in years, Ryan felt a peace that was not loneliness. He felt connection, purpose, and the quiet joy of having made a difference beyond his own life. The dragons, once desperate and frozen, were alive again. And he, a simple human mechanic, had given them hope. That night, the valley was silent, but it was no longer empty. Steam rose from 6 heat wells now alive. The snow melted gently under their warmth. The dragons rested near the cabin, their wings folded, their eyes shining faintly in the dark. Ryan sat by the stove, exhausted, but content. He thought about the journey, the dangers of the storm, the frozen machines, and the desperation in the dragon's eyes. And he smiled. He had faced every challenge, overcome every obstacle, and restored life to a frozen world. In the morning, he would continue his work, checking each heat well, making sure nothing failed. But for now, he sat in the quiet warmth, a human among dragons, a mechanic who had saved a species. The leader lifted its head, eyes meeting his once more. It rumbled softly, a promise of loyalty, a bond formed through struggle and trust. Ryan nodded, understanding without words. The valley was safe, and together they would guard it for the future. Ryan leaned back, feeling the heat of the stove and the soft warmth of the valley returning. He was no longer alone. The herd had chosen him, and he had chosen them. Together, they would survive the winters, stronger and united. The frozen land was alive again, and the human who had believed in its creatures had become a hero not through weapons, but through skill, courage, and heart. The herd of alien dragons would never forget the human mechanic who gave them hope. And Ryan would never forget the silent promise they had shared, a bond forged in frost, fire, and trust.